Welcome back. Today, we're jumping straight into your stack of sources on something that, well, affects pretty much everyone: processed food.
And specifically, the hidden issues and the nutritional myths that kind of surround it.
Yeah, especially that big one, calories in, calories out. We really want to unpack that. The goal here is to give you the knowledge to, take charge of your health.
Absolutely. Because as your sources point out, we're just bombarded with advice, right? So much of it clashes, it's hard to know what actually helps. We're going to focus on how processing impacts things like type 2 diabetes, inflammation, gut health, liver health, crucial stuff.
And really question why just counting calories? Well, it often just misses the point, doesn't it?
It really does.
So one of the sources you flagged starts with a pretty bold statement, calling processed food consumable poison.
Whoa, okay. Strong words.
Yeah, but the sources clarify it's not like some evil plot. It's more about the, let's say, unintended health fallout from the way the food industry operates for profit.
Right. And what's really interesting is the shift in perspective they push for. We're so trained to look at nutrition labels, aren't we? Fat grams, sugar, sodium. But the core message from your reading is, it's not just about those things. It's more fundamental. It's about what happened to the food during processing.
How it got made.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That industrial process, it often strips out the good stuff and adds things our bodies just, weren't designed to handle constantly.
Okay, let's really get into that. We need a kind of guidepost through all this info. Your sources suggest a simple principle, right? 6 words.
Yeah, it's a great little compass. Protect the liver, feed the gut.
Protect the liver, feed the gut. Okay.
The idea is straightforward. Real food, the stuff that truly nourishes it, does both. It helps your liver work properly, and it gives the good bacteria in your gut what they need.
And the flip side?
Well, food that fails on both counts. According to these sources, that's basically heading towards being detrimental, towards poison in their framing. If it only does one, it's kind of in a gray area.
Right, got it. So, keeping protect the liver, feed the gut in mind. Let's look at why this matters so much, especially with chronic diseases. Your sources seem pretty critical of the standard medical approach here.
Oh, definitely. They don't pull any punches. There's this stark contrast you see between how medicine handles acute problems versus chronic ones.
Right, like infections, injuries, some genetic things. Medicine's often brilliant.
Absolutely brilliant. But then you look at chronic diseases, type 2 diabetes, heart disease, fatty liver, even dementia, things that are just soaring.
Yeah.
And the sources argue the whole understanding, the whole strategy is fundamentally, off track, flawed.
Because the focus is just on managing symptoms with drugs, mostly, not the root cause.
That's the core criticism.
Yeah.
Your source talk about these 8 underlying pathologies at the cellular level, things happening inside our cells.
Yeah.
These aren't diseases themselves, more like fundamental breakdowns. And here's the kicker. They're described as nutrient sensing and foodable.
Meaning, food affects them directly.
Directly. Yeah. But, and this is key, they're generally not druggable. So, meds can manage the outward signs, maybe lower blood sugar or blood pressure, but they don't fix the underlying cellular problem. Think like mitochondrial issues or low-level inflammation. Food impacts that. Drugs, not so much, not at the root.
That's a huge shift from thinking there's a pill for everything. Exercise gets a mention though, right? But with a catch.
Definitely. Exercise is crucial, no doubt. But the phrase that jumps out is, you can't outrun a bad diet.
Heard that one before.
Yeah. It means physical activity is great, it helps a lot, but it just can't undo the damage if your diet is constantly driving those cellular problems we talked about.
And it's not just diabetes and heart disease, is it? The sources link this processed food issue to other chronic problems too.
It seems so. Things like addiction, food addiction is real depression, sleep apnea, even autoimmune conditions. They're all on the rise, and while they're complex, the sources strongly suggest our modern ultra-processed diet is a major common denominator.
Which brings us to that famous advice from Michael Pollan. Eat food, not too much, mostly plants. Sounds simple, but your sources found issues with it.
Yeah, it's a bit more complicated than it sounds, according to the critique. Eat food well. What kind of food? A whole apple or a highly processed apple-flavored snack bar? Both technically food.
Good point.
Not too much. Okay, but how much is too much? And what about foods engineered to make you want more? And mostly plants. Well, sugar is from a plant. French fries are from plants. Highly processed vegan junk food is plant-based.
Right. A diet of soda and chips is mostly plants, but obviously not healthy.
Exactly. So it comes back to that better guide. Protect the liver, feed the gut. That applies whether the food started as a plant or an animal. It cuts through the confusion.
Okay, let's shift focus to the food industry itself. Your sources use a pretty strong term, immoral hazard. What's that about?
It's a really interesting distinction they make. We know moral hazard, right? Like if you have insurance, maybe you take slightly more risks.
Yeah.
But immoral hazard, as defined here, is different. It's when the seller, the company, deliberately rigs the game. They set things up for profit, knowing it's likely to cause harm to the consumer.
And the argument is the processed food industry fits this.
That's the argument, yeah. They draw parallels to big tobacco hiding the dangers of smoking, or the oil industry and climate change. But the difference is, food isn't optional like cigarettes or, arguably, gasoline.
We have to eat.
We have to eat.
Yeah.
That makes the industry's influence and the potential harm just massive,
Wow.
pervasive.
There's data in your sources too, isn't there? Comparing U.S. healthcare spending and life expectancy.
Yeah, figure 1-1, it's pretty stark. The U.S. spends way, way more on healthcare than other developed countries,
Right.
but our average life expectancy is lower. And that gap really started widening around, guess when? The 1970s.
Right, when processed food consumption really took off.
Exactly, it's a correlation that's, well,
And
hard to
this ties
ignore.
into metabolic syndrome too, that cluster of risk factors.
Directly. The sources link the rise in metabolic syndrome. Things like belly fat, high blood pressure, high blood sugar, bad cholesterol numbers straight to this shift towards processed diets. And we saw how dangerous that was with COVID-19, right? People with metabolic syndrome had much worse
This all
outcomes.
leads perfectly into debunking that calories in, calories out idea. It sounds so simple, so scientific.
It does, doesn't it? Energy balance,
Good.
physics. But your sources argue that sticking rigidly to a calorie is a calorie has actually held back progress for decades. It's too simplistic, like judging a car only by its fuel
Why
consumption.
is it too simple? What has it missed?
Well, for starters, the sources point to the Atwater equation, the thing used to calculate calories on labels. It's old, like late 1800s old.
Seriously.
Yeah, and it makes huge assumptions. It completely ignores the gut microbiome, our gut bacteria. They metabolize a big chunk of our food, maybe 25, 30%. And fiber. Fiber changes everything about how many calories we actually absorb from
So
other
the
parts
number
of
on
the
the
food.
package isn't even the real number of calories our body gets?
Often, no. There's an example with almonds. We probably absorb about 30% fewer calories from almonds than the label calculation suggests, because of the fiber and the way our body
That's
breaks them down.
fascinating. So 100 calories of almonds isn't the same as 100 calories of, say, sugar water in terms of what our body does with it.
Not even close. The sources stress this. Where those food calories come from determines where they go. It's biochemistry, not just physics. Different foods trigger different hormones, different metabolic pathways, different effects on fat storage, inflammation.
And there's a
It's
critique in
complex.
there, too, about maybe why this calorie myth persists. Industry influence.
Well, the sources raise the question. If you're a big food company, talking only about calories is convenient, isn't it? It avoids tricky conversations about ingredients, processing methods,
Because
sugar
almost everything
content.
has calories.
Exactly. It shifts the blame entirely onto the consumer's portion control, not the nature of the food itself. And some sources mention studies, like the Sydney Diet Heart Study, where replacing saturated fat with certain vegetable oils, which was supposed to be healthier based on calorie and fat ideas,
Didn't work.
it seemed to actually worsen outcomes in some cases, even though cholesterol went down. It really challenges that whole low-fat dogma that was driven
Okay,
by the
so
calorie
calories
focus.
aren't the main story. What is? It keeps coming back to processed versus real food.
That's the absolute core of it. Real food, whole, unprocessed or minimally processed. It protects the liver, feeds the gut. Fruit, veg,
And with
whole
processed
grains, meat.
food.
By its nature, usually high sugar, low fiber, maybe weird fats. Additives, it does neither. It burdens the liver.
You won't
messes with
find
the gut.
level of processing on the nutrition label.
Nope. The label tells you what's in it chemically, but nothing about what's been done to it, how refined it is, how its structure was changed. That's the missing piece
You
for
mentioned fiber
consumers.
again. It seems absolutely critical.
It really is. Intact fiber in real food is prebiotic. It feeds good gut bacteria, helps manage blood sugar, makes you feel full. Processing usually strips it out. And the sources also briefly mention artificial sweeteners. People cut back on sugar, but metabolic syndrome didn't magically disappear. So, are sweeteners totally harmless?
And a carb is
Questions
not a
remain.
carb either.
Definitely not. A whole oat It is vastly different metabolically from the refined flour and white bread, even if the carb grams look similar. One gives steady energy, the other spikes your blood sugar. Processing
Let's get
matters
specific
immensely.
then. How does this drive type 2 diabetes?
The sources point fingers squarely at refined carbs and especially added sugars. Fructose in particular, which is half of table sugar and big in high fructose corn syrup. It hits the liver hard.
How so?
It drives fat production in the liver and promotes insulin resistance. That's the pathway to type 2 diabetes. Glucose does it too, but fructose seems particularly problematic in large
Is there evidence
processed
that
amounts.
changing this helps?
Oh yeah. The Verta Health study is mentioned. They used a ketogenic diet, very low carb, moderate protein, high healthy fat,
And the
without
result?
restricting calories. It's remarkable. Something like 80% of patients reversed their type 2 diabetes. Most got off insulin, lost significant weight. It powerfully shows that changing the type of food, restricting carbs, can work dramatically better than just cutting calories across the board for
what
this
about
condition.
inflammation? We hear that word a lot. Is it just about saturated fat?
That's a common idea, but the sources say it's more nuanced. It might not be saturated fat itself so much as saturated free fatty acids that become problematic. Where do those come from? Often from the liver processing
so sugar
excess
overload can lead to the fat byproducts that cause inflammation.
Exactly. And fructose itself can directly trigger inflammatory pathways. It highlights how interconnected it all is: nutrition, metabolism, inflammation, immunity.
And the gut and
can't
liver
separate
connection
them.
seems central. You mentioned fructose hitting the liver hard.
Yeah. Figure 2.1 in the sources details this. Glucose can be used by lots of cells, but pretty much all fructose goes straight to the liver. Too much overwhelms it.
Hitting there.
Fat buildup in the liver, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. That drives insulin resistance. It can also deplete the liver's energy supply and create uric acid, which causes other problems. High insulin also messes with hunger signals, making you want to eat more.
Leaky gut.
Vicious
What's
cycle.
That? And leaky link.
Basically, a bad diet, high processed food, low fiber, maybe antibiotics can kill off good gut bacteria and let bad ones thrive. This can damage the gut lining,
So
making it
stuff gets
permeable
through
or
that
leaky.
shouldn't.
Exactly. Bacterial toxins, undigested food particles, they leak into the bloodstream, trigger the immune system, cause inflammation system-wide, and can worsen insulin resistance, including in the liver.
Lastly, food
Another
addiction.
cycle.
Is that a real biological thing?
Defiance suggests yes. Ultra-processed foods are often engineered with specific combinations of salt, fat, sugar, maybe caffeine, designed to hit the
Like
brain's
drugs?
reward centers hard.
You.
Very similar pathways: liking, wanting, needing. The Yale Food Addiction Scale is even used to measure it. And refined sugar, stripped of its fiber like in candy or soda, acts much more like a drug than the sugar naturally
Wow.
packaged in a
Okay,
piece
that's
of
a
fruit.
lot to take in, a lot of sobering information. Let's pivot to the positive. What can people actually do? The year 2025 actionable takeaway.
Right, let's boil it down based on protect the liver, feed the gut. First, prioritize foods that help the liver. That means cutting way back on processed sugar, getting healthy fats from whole
And
sources,
second.
and enough protein. Feed the gut. Load up on fiber from whole, unprocessed plants, vegetables,
So
fruits,
practically
legumes,
speaking,
whole
read
grains.
ingredient lists, not just the nutrition facts.
Absolutely. Look for hidden sugars, weird additives. A good rule of thumb: if sugar is one of the first 3 ingredients, it's probably too much. Try to minimize those ultra-processed foods
fill the
that
cart
stuff in
with-
crinkly bags and boxes. Real food: fruits, veggies, nuts, seeds, eggs, fish, meat, whole grains like quinoa or oats, beans, lentils. Variety
You
is
mentioned
good.
a tip
Fiber
about
is
nighttime
key.
blood pressure, too.
Yeah, an interesting one. If your blood pressure doesn't dip properly overnight, try cutting added sugar drastically for a week. See if it makes a difference. It can be a clue about
And keep
insulin
an eye on
resistance
waist
affecting blood pressure.
circumference.
For sure, it's a simple, useful marker for metabolic health. Belly fat is often linked to these issues. And finally, while not for everyone, for some people with serious blood sugar issues, a well-formulated low-carb or keto diet using real foods
This
might
has
be
been
a powerful
incredibly
tool under
insightful.
guidance.
It really drives home that focusing on food processing and nurturing our liver and gut is so much more important than just counting calories.
Definitely. It's about understanding what real food actually is and how it works with our
The
biology.
sources you brought
rather
give
than
people a
against
real
it.
foundation to make better choices. Choices that could really impact type 2 diabetes risk, inflammation, gut health, all of it.
Hopefully, yes. It's about taking back control by
And it leaves us
understanding
with a
the
final
deeper
thought, doesn't it?
mechanisms.
Think about how deep that calories in, calories out idea runs. Who benefits from keeping things that simple? From ignoring the complexity of food in our bodies? It's worth asking yourself that next time you're looking at a food label. Prioritize real food.